Hey everyone, welcome back to the Global Medical Device Podcast. My name is Etienne Nichols. I'm the host for today's episode, and in this episode of the podcast, we're planning to uncover some of the most commonly overlooked aspects of U.S. MedTech compliance, which is state level registration and regulations. It's not just about getting your 510K from the FDA. It's also about successfully navigating the U.S. market, which requires understanding a complex web of state-specific requirements, sales tax laws, distribution challenges. Whether you're expanding domestically or entering from abroad, this episode should provide critical insights to help you avoid compliance pitfalls and make informed strategic decisions. And to talk about this is my guest, Adam Steadman. He's a seasoned global executive in the medical device and diagnostic sector with over 3 decades of leadership experience spanning commercialization, clinical development, and strategic advisory. He currently serves as CEO of MDD Options, and Adam has played pivotal roles in driving U.S. market expansion and successful exits, including his tenure as Chief Commercial Officer for Smart Trial during its acquisition by Greenlight Guru. And he's a chartered accountant by training. Adam brings a unique blend of financial acumen and operational expertise to the medtech industry. How are you doing today, Adam?
Thank you, Etienne. I'm very well, thank you. Thank you for that introduction.
Glad to have you with us today. I know when I look at what you post online and some of the things that you're talking about, you're passionate about making sure medical device companies avoid the valley of death, but not the one that most startups think of, not the product realization or go-to-market fit, but more of the post-clearance, that commercialization pitfall valley of death after you have your regulatory approval, for example. Is that accurate? And would you elaborate on any of that?
Absolutely. It's something I am passionate about. I've seen many issues and problems arise because of this. First thing I'm going to say is, when did you last go to a conference or a meeting talking about getting your product to market, where they spoke about getting your 510K or they spoke about getting your PMA, spoke about quality aspects, they spoke about your ISO standards and FDA requirements and MDR and all these things? When did you ever hear them talk about state level registrations? Never. It's never brought up. When do they talk about all the complications of having a warehouse management system, of having to be able to track serial numbers, lot numbers, expiration dates, and manage sales taxes and sales tax exemptions? There's so much to consider and think about. And so what the observation I have is I've been talking to companies, mainly foreign companies, because if you come from Israel or you come from Germany and you've worked with, say, VAT, you have no idea what the concept of sales tax is. And the biggest issue, I think, is the companies overseas coming into the US. They think they're coming into the US, a single country. Well, they're coming into 50 states and DC, and it's not a single country. There's a lot more to it. It's a lot more complex. There are a lot of issues. Some states are easy, some states are difficult. Thresholds are different. Crazy as the FDA definition of a medical device differs from the state level definitions.
Yeah, that's a really good observation. You're absolutely right. I don't know if I've ever heard anybody talk about it. I guess to answer your rhetorical question, and the fact that something you mentioned, how the U.S. not necessarily being a single country is a pretty good perspective, especially when you consider how many states will sue the government, to block certain things. So, I mean, everybody wants to do their own thing, be their own little mini country within the United States. So, all that being said, what are some of the first state level steps a medtech company should take after receiving their 510 clearance or whatever, whether a PMA or the other areas? What are some of these steps that they need to be taking?
Well, the first thing is, it depends very much on how you go to market. If you go to market through a distribution network, your distributor's already probably got all those things in place, and you certainly should have if you're going with a distributor. If you're going direct, you need to be considering the requirements and regulations and so forth. So when you look at state level regulations, you really need to, for your product, research pretty much every state and see what the requirements are. And the reason for that is, if you have a drug combination in any of your products, so you're doing a combination product, that's led by the CEDA, not CDRH, you will probably have to register in every state in the country. So that's 50 states plus DC. And that's because pharmaceutical regulations are very tight, because obviously they want to control things like oxycodone and all these other drugs that are very attractive to sideline from the pharmacy. And the State Board of Pharmacy state by state or whatever they call it in the state. Sometimes it differs. The State Board of Pharmacy is called that, not the State Board of Medical Devices. So the standard is the drug standard you've got to follow first of all, and then it falls back to med device. So then the next thing is, well, okay, does that mean that you have to look at all states? Well, only 24 states actually require registration. Up to 24 states require registration if there is no drug component to it. But having said that, that's 24 states that require registration. Certain states and a number of states have specific regulations relating to DME, durable medical equipment, when it's sold directly to patient. So I'm talking about things like blood oxygen systems and things like that, or sorry, oxygen systems, I should say rather. Just sent to the patient, but that has to be either financed or maintained over a period of time. And honestly, for things like that, you really need to have a huge network. They have regulations in many states that say that you have to operate within, you have to have premises within 100 miles of where you operate. But just imagine the kind of network you'd need across the US to comply with that, to be a national distributor of one of those products, or national supplier of those products, even if you're the manufacturer. So, at that point, so if we then look at the 24 states, you then have to look at them state by state and look at the regulations. How do they define a medical device? Some of them actually say a medical device is something that is stated by the FDA, has to be issued with a prescription. So they define it as being a prescription required medical device, not being, so it's a completely different definition than you normally have for a device. And then you've also got varying levels of requirement. California has 2 organizations that you have to register with. And then if you manufacture in California, there's a 3rd registration requirement. In California, the foreign manufacturer has to register in California along with the distributor. In most other states, a foreign manufacturer doesn't have to register, just the distributor. If you manufacture in Texas and sell the product in Texas, you have to register. But if you don't manufacture it in Texas, you don't need to at all. So there's a huge variability in regulations, and it varies according to your product. It is not simple. There's a lot that goes into it. And this is why it takes companies months and months and months to get on the market. The alternative is what I believe many companies do. Ignore the regulations and hope they don't get caught. That's really not the point. We talk about regulatory strategies, and we talk about regulatory all the time in this business, and QA, and making sure we're doing things right. Well, state compliance is a regulatory requirement. State sales tax is a regulatory requirement. State income tax is a regulatory requirement. All of these things need to be considered and thought about when going to market, and you need to be legally compliant. It's not okay to break the rules.
Yeah. And aside from that that non-strategy, I guess of just ignoring the rules, it sounds like maybe there's potential for multiple different strategies as well. I've not really heard much about this. It's completely open, so I'm trying to come at this with a beginner's mindset. But if I have a medical device company and I'm coming to the US for the first time and I learn about this, does this mean, I mean, my immediate reaction is, well, okay, do I analyze each state for the addressable market within each state and then do a piecewise approach, or is there another way? Or what are your thoughts as far as the different strategies and approaches?
So the easiest approach is to go to distribution model. Get a national distributor or something like that. They're not effective ways of doing things. And the reason for it, there's a number of them, and I don't want to be critical specifically of any one company, but very often they have their own branded products. So when they'll, and this is a pitfall that many people don't realize. You have a new wound care product, for instance, and you decide to go to a major distributor of the wound care. And I'm being careful not to mention names, because I almost did that. I don't want to get sued.
Yeah.
But what can happen is you could have a product that's superior to the one that they're selling, but the one they're selling, they have ownership of, and they make 80% margin, whereas your product, they only make 30% margin. They could sign a deal with you, a 3-year deal, non-compete, exclusive deal, and then they can put that on their listing and sell the absolute minimum required to maintain the contract, and effectively block you from the market. So there's lots of pitfalls and things you really have to be careful about in this. So distribution model, it can work really nicely for some companies, but some companies it doesn't. So what do you do? If you're going to go direct, um, there's several ways of doing this. One is you can look at it and say, okay, my primary customers are, and then, maybe you've got a product that you've been trialing in hospitals for the last 3 years and you've done your pivotal here, and you have 10 hospitals or 20 hospitals that you've worked with. Well, then maybe decide which states are those in. Well, they're only in 6 states. And now I'm going to focus on those 6 states because they're going to be my first customers. So that's one way of doing it. The problem with that is it's not really good with expansion. And the problem with that also is that the big name hospitals, the Johns Hopkins and the Cleveland Clinic and CHOC and all these other places, TMC, pretty much every one of them is in one of the states that is heavily regulated. Wyoming doesn't come up very often as the biggest hospital in the country.
Right.
Alaska doesn't either. You know what I mean? So yeah, you've got 24 states you've got to register in, but 24 of the most important states.
Yeah.
So, that's the problem. But so you've got two choices. One is you go for where your first customers are going to be, or you look at it and say, other hybrid models. I mean, MDD Options, my company offers a hybrid model, and that's why we've set it up to get around some of these problems. And I didn't mean get around to make these problems somebody else's problem, make them my problem and not your problem. Is the plan.
Right.
Um, um, but you've got the other option is just to say, okay, so which of the 26 states I don't have to register in? And that's fair ground. That's fair game. I'll go and sell to them immediately, first off, while I'm building the rest.
Right.
Now, whichever strategy you take, one thing is make sure you follow the rules. Two is make sure you're doing nothing in the market to damage future sales. You don't want to be setting precedent by going into states where you have less regulation, and because of that, you may be harming your market in some other way. And there are areas that I'm not an expert in. There's a lot of the reimbursement considerations and payments and local
Sure.
payments and so forth that you've got to think about. So that's one thing. And
Well, question about that. I'm curious if you could maybe or if you're able to elaborate how some of those state registration requirements vary. And is there,
sure,
I mean, yeah,
yeah, absolutely. So some states will say if you're selling a medical device, you have to register with them, and that would be a class 2 or class 3. Another state might say, well, prescription products only. You only have to register prescription products. And remember, prescription products aren't necessarily ones a doctor's going to write, scribble on a notepad or send an electronic prescription on. Pretty much anything that's a class 3 device is going to be a prescription product as far as the FDA is concerned. So even though you don't write a prescription for a stent, it is still a prescription product.
I see.
So it still does have fairly wide coverage. But then the other thing is, when it comes to the actual registrations, one or two of the states, and it's only one or two of them, it's really fill in the form, send the tax, and be done with. They take their $300 a year from every device distributor, and they're happy. Other ones want you to set up your facility first. So you got your 510K, you go and rent some premises, you set up your facility. They want to see the security requirements. And again, remember what I said about these being state boards of pharmacy that are looking at this. They're looking at this from an oxycodone theft perspective, not from somebody's going to steal a stent, because nobody would ever do that. So what they're wanting to see is they're wanting to see photographs of your facility. They want to see your procedures. They want to see your cages. They want to see your specific security systems. They want to know that you've got all of the controls that are required. So you've got to do all of that. You've got to go and get fingerprints done, background checks on order management. There's a ton of things, and some states require them, other states don't, and they differ by state. The definition of when it's required differs for each state. So it really is a landmine. It's very hard to do, and there aren't many consultants who specialize in this space.
Yeah, I mean, you mentioned at the beginning. I still, it's interesting question. Having never heard this, when's the last time you heard somebody talking about statewide requirements, or state-specific requirements? I'm curious though. I mean, if a lot of companies do try to sidestep this, what the real world impact of ignoring these or delaying this state level compliance would be? Any thoughts there?
Um, well, the good news is at the state level. You're not going to get a 483. You're not going to get a warning letter. So that's the positive side.
So it may
You know,
not be a lot
states
of
have got
bad
different.
PR, perhaps. So yeah.
Yeah, it's bad PR. You can get sued. I mean, to be honest, states sue companies all day long, and you never hear about 90% of it.
Mm.
So you know, what's the big impact? I would say when you're doing due diligence with a strategic, and they're looking at your data room and they're looking at how you got your compliance set up and so forth, and you're not compliant, they're not going to be very impressed. So, you know, there's lots of things you got to think about here that maybe it's not the state that's going to care. Maybe it's the investor. Maybe it's the strategic. Now, a lot of these things you might say, well, when you get bought, it doesn't matter. They don't want my infrastructure anyhow, and they don't. And that's why you shouldn't really necessarily be building all that infrastructure, because you know you're building it for what purpose? If you know you're going to get bought, or you're certainly hoping you're going to get bought soon, why build the infrastructure? But it does speak a lot to the professionalism of your organization. If I'm going to put $40 million into your company to help you commercialize, I want to see that you've been following the rules.
Yeah.
Because if you haven't been, do I really want to be in business with you?
Yeah. And you know, you're talking about whether or not a strategic is going to care, you know, take away all of your infrastructure. I think that's kind of an interesting point, because a lot of companies want to be bought, you know, before that we won't even make it to
Sorry,
market.
which
But
one doesn't?
that's not really true. Yeah. The more I
Yeah,
hear, the more companies I talk to, that's always the desire, but it's very rarely the case. They usually, especially for 510K or class 2, people
yeah.
want to see a little bit of market viability before they are interested in acquiring that company. So, is that something you've seen?
Oh yeah, no, absolutely no question about it. And to your point, you know, you think of the number of companies that have actually gone to commercialization before they got bought. There aren't many. I mean, the recent one of um, Edwards' acquisition of
I'm
tip
not
my
going to think
tongue.
of
I
it.
can't think of the name of the company
I'm not
now.
going to think of it right
Okay,
now either, but maybe it'll come to.
Endotronics.
What is it?
Endotronics. So
Endotronics.
Endotronics,
Yeah.
yeah.
Okay.
You know, that was a surprise to everyone because it happened so quickly. I mean, they announced that they got their approval and bang, next thing we know, they've been bought. And that, you know, but that is the exception to the rule, no question about it. But so there's a couple of things. One is probably the best way. So you say, you know, you brought up the question earlier about, well, how do you get around the state, or how do you navigate the state regulations?
Mm-hmm.
Well, one of the things to think about is, are you going to run pilot studies? Well, not pilot studies. Sorry, you've done studies maybe, or maybe you haven't, but let's not talk about them as studies. Let's talk them as pilot launches.
Mm.
You're going to launch in a specific territory. You're going to launch in a specific area, and you're going to measure feedback and get feedback from your users, from your customers, from your patients. Um, so you know you can use things like that, and you could be strategic about which states you choose. You could choose to do that in states that don't require the registrations and regulations covered. Again, though, it comes back to the problem of, well, you probably want to do it in the places that have got big badge recognition. And so, you know, you probably get stuck going to those states that you were hoping to avoid. Um, um, Sorry, I've got a call coming in
No
and
worries. That's okay. I'm
just killing it.
You got me kind of curious about some of the specific things. My mind just goes to something like varying sales tax laws. I know some companies or some states have much higher sales tax than others, and that is likely going to impact your pricing models and the structure of how you price things out. But
So
what are the different things there?
yeah,
Any
so
little, yeah.
no, it's interesting you bring that up. I hadn't mentioned sales tax yet. That's a whole another cluster that you've got to deal with as a manufacturer. Now, look, honestly, you can get your accounting firm or whatever to manage and deal with this, but it's still got to be done. So you've got 46 states out of 50 states in DC that require registration for sales tax. So you've got to do the registration. That's the first thing. So well, not before. In each state, you have to reach Nexus before you have to register for sales tax. So what that means is that you've got to hit a certain level of economic activity in that state. In some states, it means that you've done $100,000 worth of transactions. In other states, it's 200 transactions. So it's either a dollar base or it's a quantity of
Mm.
transactions base. It applies to software. So when you're doing SAMD and things like that, it also applies to that. But you've got to do the registrations when you hit that nexus. not only have you done that, but when you've been selling your product without charging sales tax, if the product is subject to sales tax in the state, the buyer is actually obliged to submit use tax returns on the stuff that sales tax hasn't been paid for. Now, again, that's one of those regulations that doesn't get followed very often. But if you're a high volume buyer in a state, um, and I'm
Like
throwing out a name
disposables.
here, I have no
Yeah.
idea what their situation is, but take an organization like Kaiser. Suppose that they were buying stuff. They're big enough to have the attention of this tax authorities looking at their use tax and are they paying use tax. And so now you're introducing another level of hassle for the for the hospital that's buying the product. Not only have they got to buy the product from you, but they've got to track whether or not you've charged sales tax on it, and therefore do they have to pay the use tax. Now this is getting into finite detail. It's probably not important, but I think the more important thing to consider here is when you do register, you have to be once you have registered, you're probably not going to be charging sales tax for med device products. Generally speaking, there will be exemptions. So in fact, from a pricing perspective, it's not really going to impact you. And usually your contracts will be X tax anyhow. But that doesn't change the fact that for every single hospital, ASC, doctor, whatever it is that you sell to that has an exemption, they still have to provide you with an exemption certificate. You still have to maintain that exemption certificate on file and have it available for audit. You've still got to do monthly returns. You've still got to do monthly remittances. And even if you don't have to do remittances because 100% of your sales were exempt, you've still got to do the returns. So whichever way you look at it, there's a huge amount of work to do there.
Yeah. You mentioned some of the risks, some of the red flags, I guess, of entering that maybe a long-term distribution contract with somebody. I'm kind of my mind's going back to that a little bit. And how would you assess whether a distributor, logistics provider, whoever, how do you assess whether they're really aligned with what your product and business, what your goals are?
So they're probably not. Let's start there and then figure out how we mitigate that problem, because their objectives and your objectives are probably not the same thing. A manufacturer, when they take on a distribution, so let's look at a big national manufacturer, I said manufacturer, I meant distributor. If we're talking about, look at a national distributor and they take on your product, what they're going to do is they're going to say to you, okay, we can sell 10,000 items per year, but we're going to build up to that over 5 years. So we're going to sell 500 first year, 2,000 second year, and so forth. And maybe it's a high value product. Maybe it's $50,000 for each one that they sell. But the way they're going to look at that is they're going to say, okay, we've got to invest money into getting this into the market and making some progress with it. Either that, or we just let it sit on the shelf and it'll sell by accident and we're not going to put too much effort into it. In the situation where it's a big deal, what they're going to do is they can say, we'll commit to selling 1,000 a year, but we want an exclusive deal. And the manufacturer's thinking, well, you should be able to sell 2,000 a year, and I don't think I'm giving you exclusive. Well, that's the first butt of heads that happens with that model. And then the problem is, because they're building a market, because they are supposedly investing in your market and education in the market, putting their salespeople in front of doctors and administrations and so forth, they're not giving it back to you at the end of 3 years, just saying, oh, here it is. Or you decide to do a strategic deal with a major manufacturer and you want to exit out after 6 months. If you signed a 3-year deal and you're only 6 months in it and you want to get out, you pay to get out of it. There's a big price to pay, and that can be in the millions. Depends what your product is and what the volumes are. But it can be a really, really tricky way of doing things. And so, really what you need to be doing is looking at ways of reducing that. And, you said also logistics, how does logistics sign? Logistics companies do the same thing. They also want to sign a long-term contract. A lot of them have invested a lot of money in warehousing. When you put a lot of money in warehousing, you can't afford to have customers walk in and walk out. So what you do is you try to tie them in for as long as you can. So generally there'll be a 2 or 3 year contract with a logistics company as well. And that, again, without being self-serving, that's one of the problems I'm trying to solve. That's why MDD Options is called Options, to give manufacturers the option to exit, because that's how business actually works. It shouldn't be an adversarial relationship between you and your distributor or you and your logistics company. It shouldn't be a situation where for you to do what's best for your company, you have to pay somebody a couple of $1 million to change, to pivot or change, or just go with the best deal that suits you. It should be your option to. You develop the product. It should be your option to be able to get the product where you need it to be.
Yeah. I'm curious. I want to get into that winning go-to-market strategy, what that looks like for new devices entering the US. But before we leave, kind of the pitfalls, I wonder if there are any other common pitfalls for distribution compliance when it comes to this international companies entering the US. Any thoughts come to mind?
Well, first thing I'll comment on is, yes, it's more attractive or more concerning, I guess, for foreign companies because they're less aware of these things. But most of these problems apply to domestic companies as much as international
Sure.
companies. Sure. So the other ones we haven't spoken about, a couple of simple ones here. One is Secretary of State registrations. If you do business in the state, and I was looking into one from Minnesota just a few days ago. So in Minnesota, the regulations say that if you do business in this state, you are not allowed to do so without a certificate allowing you to do so.
Hmm.
What is a certificate? It's a $200 something payment. It's a tax at the end of the day. And if you can imagine, a few 100,000 companies doing business in your state, it adds up, and there's quite a lot of cash coming into the Secretary of State for that. But when you look at the definition, the way they had it is if you do more than one, if you do anything that's not incidental transactions, and the way they define that is if you transact more than once every 30 days.
Hmm.
So if you do 3 sales in a week, technically you've hit their threshold. If you do one this month and one in 2 months' time, then you'll probably get away with it. But again, are they policing it? Probably not. But at the end of the day, it still comes down to, do you want to comply with the regulations or not? And the bottom line is, if you're going to be serious about doing your business and you're going to do business in that state, what are the state's rules for doing business there? When you hit the threshold and you're doing it, you need to pay the tax. And
Yeah.
that's a common pitfall. Another one that people forget about is, you and I, when we do our annual taxes every year, we do a federal tax, and you do your where are you
State.
guys? Ohio.
Say again?
What state are you in? Ohio.
Tennessee. So no
Ten,
income
oh,
no
oh,
income
of
state
course.
tax here.
Yeah. Oh, okay. So you're one of the 7 states that doesn't have. Okay,
Right.
well, that's cool. Florida's the same. I think Oregon is the same, etc. But here in North Carolina, I have the displeasure of having to submit a federal tax return and a state tax return. Companies are no different. And foreign companies have very often got absolutely no idea about this until it's too late. Not that it's too late. I mean, these
Sure.
things can always get fixed. But you come in as a foreign company, you're working in 40 states. Next thing you know, 36 of those states require you to submit income tax returns. Well, it's not just submitting a return. It's now you've got to analyze your sales. And even harder, you've got to analyze your cost base and allocate it state by state so you can determine how much of your labor cost or how much of your distribution cost related to South Carolina, which is 100 miles down the road from me, or Alaska, which costs 5 times more to get the product to. And it's not just shipping charges, it's all the other costs you've got to allocate and how they get allocated and what's a fair apportionment and all the rest.
Yeah.
And there are massive departments, and I'm quite sure all the strategics are big departments with lots of AI, lots of software, lots of clever people, lots of CAs, just figuring out these issues and problems. Now, I'm kind of exaggerating it a little bit because obviously when you're a multi-billion-dollar corporation, it makes a bit more impact. But the principles are the same, and you don't have to get to massive levels of sales. If you were doing $10 million worth of sales in the US, across the US, all of these problems are very real.
Right. Yeah, I can see that. I can see that getting really complicated really fast, having done multiple and worked in multiple states. Yeah, I remember living across state lines and having to do 2 state income taxes one year, and I wouldn't want to do 40.
Exactly. There we go. There we
Oh,
go.
any other pitfalls before we move on from that? Any other things come to mind?
Um, no, the only thing is a couple of things that spring to mind. One is software is a medical device, clinical decision support software.
Yeah.
These things are often forgotten about, and there's different ways of doing them. I mean, I talk about distribution of software, and when I'm talking about distribution of software, I'm not talking about putting a USB stick in a FedEx envelope, or going to Digital River and downloading software or something like that. What I'm talking about is I'm sitting in a doctor's office in Chicago and I am accessing a AI-driven software system that improves the readings of an X-ray I'm doing. And I'm paying on a pay-per-click or a monthly subscription or whatever it is, and it happens to be a German company or it happens to be a California company. It makes no difference. I'm buying products from those companies. Those companies are selling products to me, be it pay-per-click, be it monthly, whatever, monthly subscription, whatever it is. There's still sales tax requirements. If it's software is a medical device, it's still a medical device per the FDA. It still has reporting requirements and compliance, the other compliance issues. As a foreign IP owner and foreign software company, I still have to have a domestic US-based initial importer and US agent. I still have those requirements. Just because the software doesn't change any of that. Obviously, I don't have serial numbers and lot numbers to worry about, but that's about the only thing that sort of gets obviated by being software. So you still have the state-by-state requirements in most respects. You still, in fact, some states are even tighter on software than they are on medical devices, so that kind of gives you a double whammy. And you've got as I say, the FDA requirements where medical devices are medical devices, be they software or not.
Yeah. There's something
So
else
yeah, I think there's a lot of things here that people really don't realize that they
for
should be
sure.
considering.
Yeah. And I don't know if you want to touch on government purchasing processes versus private sector. I know that's a whole
Well,
nother thing.
actually, there's a couple of things that you bring to mind another thing there as well, which I'll mention after government. So yes, government is a completely different setup. You do need to have different ways of looking at it. You have many distributors that won't touch government. You say, well, how big is government? We don't have a government healthcare system, and that's a valid question. The biggest healthcare system in the country, though, happens to be the
Right.
Veterans Health Administration. So yes, if you're going to be serious about selling a product in this country, yes, you have to think about how you're going to work with the government. It does require registration. It does require setting up with them. Foreign status isn't necessarily a problem. Size of your business is a problem. If you're a big company overseas and you're just coming into the US for the first time now, if you get classified as a big company, it's a lot harder to sell than a small company set aside. And there's other ways of registering to get even more preferential treatment under certain programs and so forth. That is a different area to think about, but it's definitely an area that you've got to be considered.
Okay.
You've got to consider. One of the other areas that I have no idea how these two connect because they shouldn't do, but it did sort of bring it to mind. The other area is veterinary use. You get this particularly with products like wound care products and things like that. If I've got a wound care product that's going to work on a horse as well as it's going to work on a human, well, how does that impact? So the first thing is veterinary devices have very few controls. They don't have a requirement for pre-market notifications. There's no such thing as a 510K or equivalent
Right.
For medical devices. So I have a wound care product. That means that I can bring it in and use it on a horse. It may be the same product that I'd use on a human. The thing is, there are very clear distinctions there. First of all, you've got to make sure you label it for veterinary use only. And you can't even hint that it can be used for human use.
Right.
Don't let that come up in your social media feed that in UK you're using it for humans, because, and quite frankly, my advice to manufacturers would be separate your brands. Don't use the same brand for a veterinary product as you do for a human product. That's one way of helping around that. But what people forget is the veterinary product, you still need an initial importer. You still have to meet the FDA requirements for importation. You still need to have product complaints managed, etc. And if your device is harming animals, there could be requirements to actually do reporting to the
mod database or no?
No,
No,
not
no,
at all.
no.
I'm blanking on the government agency that the government agency that covers agriculture. I can't think of their name.
USDA?
Yes, that's the one.
USDA.
Yeah. US Department of Agriculture. I mean, it
Right.
wasn't a hard name I know, I just couldn't think of it. I kept thinking Ministry of Agriculture because I guess part of my background is in other countries, and I knew it
Yeah.
wasn't Ministry of Agriculture.
Well,
That's the
you have
problem.
my respect for the level of detail that you're aware of in this country, having not been originally from this country. It's pretty impressive,
Well, I've been
actually.
here for 25 years, so I hopefully have picked up something.
Well, one other question I have, I mean,
So,
maybe I'll blend a few questions into one, so you'll forgive me if I do this, but I'm curious. So I mentioned, what does a winning go-to-market strategy look like then for a new device entering the US or domestic initial launch? And are there tools, platforms, ways of streamlining compliance, registration, and distribution tracking, all these different things? What does that look like then?
um, yes, this is a simple answer. Yes, there are ways of doing all of those things.
Yes.
And the question is, there's multiple facets to think about here. One is, do you have the expertise? And again, coming into the country or doing it domestically, I'm a physician, entrepreneur, inventor, come up with a fantastic new tool. Um, do I, and I've spent the last 5 years talking to design companies and manufacturers and regulatory and QA and so forth, and I've never had any involvement with accountants or people who deal with state regulations and all that kind of thing. So,
Right.
there's the first thing is, you probably don't have the knowledge, and you probably need to make sure that you're seeking that knowledge out and finding the companies that do have it. There are a number of companies out there that do specialize in this space. Not that many, but there are some, and some of the bigger companies, bigger, more globally oriented regulatory companies have these services. Um,
Those
so
figuring out those
that's
unknown unknowns is kind of what you're talking about. You
yeah,
really need to
ex
know those. Yep.
exactly. So that's um, one aspect of it. Sorry, you bundled up lots of things into that, and I'm now
No,
trying
no.
to unpick them.
Yeah, well, just in general, the what a winning strategy looks like. That's the thing that I picked out too is, and that I would apply to my own knowledge, is the fact that I have this lack of knowledge with whether state regulation. You mentioned Minnesota, the Secretary of State, the income tax requirements, the registration for those 24 states. All of those things are probably not very well known, and I'm guessing there are other things that are equally or lesser known, and just intricacies like, how much does it cost to ship something to Alaska where you have very few sales versus something down the road in South Carolina, or maybe somewhere in Tennessee that has very high sales tax? Yeah, all of those are intricacies that I can see that knowledge being very important for the success. But what are some other aspects that you feel like are important to think about?
So, well, I'm going to be a little self-serving here and talk about what I'm trying to achieve. I know this isn't an
Sure.
advertising channel, but it's going to sound like one a little bit. What I've done is essentially looked at that whole bundle and said, well, what is the issue here? Well, the issue is the manufacturer wants to control sales, and they kind of need to, because if they don't control sales, they get, not always, there's always a caveat, there's always good operators out there, but they've got the risk of working with a distributor that hasn't got their best interests at heart, that is going to take the line because
There's some
they
counter
haven't had it,
incentives.
or in case they can get sales without putting any effort into it. But if you get a distributor that can make sales for you without putting effort into it, um, they're basically blocking your market. So what I did is I looked at this and said, what's the big issue here? Well, the big issue is that companies then try to do it themselves and spend forever trying to get through these regulations, get their state regulations and done and so forth. So what I've done effectively is created a hybrid distribution model. And what the model entails is if you like, a front end, back end type setup. The front end is the sales activities. The manufacturer is responsible for all of the sales activities. That is everything from running a sales team, and you can use PEOs and things like that, professional employment organizations, if you're a foreign company, to have an entity here that will manage your staff on a sort of personal one-to-one basis, whereas you provide the direction that they're offering. It's a co-employment setup, and you can use organizations like that, um, and um, and so you manage the messaging. as the manufacturer, you're probably going to the scientific sessions and the trade shows and all this stuff anyhow. You've probably got the relationships with the KOLs. Well, if you're using those relationships already anyhow, keep with that. You're paying for the reimbursement strategy consultants and so forth. You're paying for the company that's helping you with the value analytics committee or analysis committee, I should say.
Right.
So all of these things that you've got in your commercialization, you're probably having to fund anyhow. So all you're adding is the sales team. So you're adding a sales team, and that's the front end of the model. So anything to do with sales is the front end. The back end of the model is everything else I've been talking about. It's a hassle. Building a warehouse management system, having warehouses, having, things as simple as the SOPs that go behind the warehouse management and the serial number tracking and the rotation of time expiring devices, of getting all those registrations with all the states. So the thing is, with the way I've got the model is because we do all of that, we're not going out and getting the registration with the states for you. We have them already ourselves. So as we have them as an organization, we're reselling your product, and it has to be on a resale model. But by being on a resale model, what it means is that we collect the sales tax, we manage the sales tax thresholds, we manage the sales tax exemptions, we manage the state-by-state Secretary of State registrations, we manage the income tax at the end of the year. So what we're doing is basically providing a model that allows manufacturers, be they domestic or foreign, to get to market months and months quicker without building infrastructure. They build a sales infrastructure, but that's IP in some respect when you're selling a company. Believe me, Stryker, Medtronic, Edwards, not one of these companies wants to buy your warehouse management system.
Right.
I promise you. I absolutely promise. They don't. So all that infrastructure you're building that you only need for 6 months or something, why are you building it when you have no intention of keeping it? But you have the option to keep it if you say, no, this is going swimmingly well, we're going for an IPO.
Yeah.
And maybe that's going to be a better option for you. And you have the option to keep going that way, and you still have the infrastructure you need to be able to do it. So that's really what I've tried to set up. And it's just to get manufacturers to market quicker, get their products on the market quicker, make them more successful, and ultimately to avoid the valley of death.
Yeah. Well, I hope you're successful in that because, we always put out a report at Greenlight Guru every year after interviewing. I think this year it was 536, if I get that number correct. Last year was 613 medical device professionals to see just the state of the industry. And, I've learned there's about 75% of medical device companies fail. And it's hard that there are multiple valleys of death, as I'm learning, for a medical device startup. And this is one that I hope you are successful in helping them get through that and successfully. So
Well, you and me both. Thank you, Adrian.
any last pieces of advice, recommendations, thoughts that you want to give the audience?
Well, I guess a couple of things. One is I'll talk to foreign companies first. Do not be surprised that the market is way more complex than you ever imagined it was. It's not just the complexity of trying to get your CPT codes or your GPO contracts set up and so forth. There's so much more to it than that. So that's the first thing. And remember that you need help, you need local help. You can't do everything from overseas, but the solution isn't to necessarily set up a company with a post box in Delaware and say, oh, we've got a US company, because it's there's a little bit more to it than that, like physical premises and things like that. You can also burn through massive amounts of money if you're not careful. And the point is, burning through money is multifold. One is you're spending money doing things that are not adding long-term value. Like building warehouse management systems that nobody else wants. But also, it's the opportunity cost of not being in the market earlier. I'm on the MedTech Innovator program, and we look at lots of new innovations coming through. And I can't tell you how many times I've seen somebody presenting a breakthrough new product that we're going to have on the market in a couple of years. And you look at it and think, yeah, there's 3 of those in this room.
Who's first, right?
And if you're 6 months behind the guy there, you could well find that you don't have any market because he's already taken it. And, if you've got three players in the market, number three doesn't come in and take a third.
Yeah.
Just remember that. So, time is money. Time makes a difference. Getting to market quickly makes a difference. Having the ability to go into a contract and say, I've actually been in this market already. I can tell you that my product sells. I can tell you what my price points are. I can tell you the feedback from my first surgeons using the product in a commercial setting, not a clinical trial.
Right.
So, you can start presenting that kind of information um, by getting in early.
I think that's good advice. Anything specific to, and it may have, I missed it. You said you were speaking to European companies first. Have we switched over to US companies?
Oh, yeah, I kind of did. Some of that apply to US companies as well. Yeah, so the foreign companies, the main thing is that you will be surprised as a foreign company
Sure.
about the complexity of it. And one of the common ones is like VAT and sales tax. Well, they're both taxes on products. Well, they work completely differently.
Yeah.
Spoiler alert, you deal with one entity in Europe when you're dealing with VAT. You're dealing with 46 entities in the US when you're dealing with it. Just
Mm.
little things to think about there. Um, I think the other thing is just be very careful about locking yourself into commitments. And
Yeah.
I think that's probably one of the biggest problems. And very often it's a problem you think you can't avoid. You know, when it comes to negotiating contracts, and you're the small guy, you're the little startup company, don't exactly have a lot of leverage on a contract. So you can get pushed into all sorts of things, and you can get people smiling behind the webcam or whatever it happens to be, um, promising you a wonderful deal that looks great to you, and you don't really know what their true agenda is.
Mm.
Sometimes it is blocking you in the market. They're making sure you just can't progress. They can
Yeah.
lock you down in a way that happens. I'm not saying that happens all the time, but be aware that there are pitfalls that you need to think about, and get professional advice.
Yeah. Just
And that
mentioning
goes
those
for domestic
margins.
companies as much as international companies. Sorry.
Yeah. Just mentioning those margins earlier. If a company is a leader in the market and 80% margins, and then you have something similar at 30% margin, it makes total sense that they would want, to block that. I am a believer in humanity, but I also believe in following the money. So,
Well, I mean, the end of the day, you can't go to your investors and say, well, all I care about is the patient, because they're not going to invest in you if all
right.
you care about is the patient. Yes, we're all in this business to support improvement of medical devices, improvement of healthcare, and so forth. But it's got to be done practically. And
Absolutely.
practically means you have to think about the commercial aspects that go with it.
Yeah.
And because, quite frankly, none of this innovation would happen if we didn't have these commercial constructs that enable people to make money.
Yeah.
We'd be in the dark ages with our technology.
Absolutely. Well, Adam, how can people get a hold of you? And where could they find out more about what you're doing and what? Yeah.
Thank you very much for that. Yeah, getting hold of me, very easy. Website, www.mddoptions.com, real
Okay.
simple. First name dot last name at MDD Options, so Adam.Steadman at mddoptions.com. Happy to give out my cell phone number. If I get spammed to death, I'll change it. But for the moment, it's 919-500-6932. And LinkedIn, of course.
Sure.
So please join me on LinkedIn. I'd love to connect.
Okay, well, we'll put your information in the show notes as well, so people are able to reach out to you. You might be the first person who's offered their cell phone number on an episode.
Hey, I'm open. As I said,
So
I'll change the number in a heartbeat if I have to.
it's a lot easier than you think, but sometimes it doesn't hurt to have it out there. That's really cool. So we'll put that in the show notes. Definitely check that out. And Adam, thank you so much for being on the podcast today. Those of you who've been listening, thank you so much for listening once again, and we look forward to seeing you all next time, everybody. Until then, take care.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Etienne.